And the speakers of the today's session, they are all so versatile personalities. Justice Rajiv Bhalla ji, Mr. Anil Malhotra, Malhotra ji are a senior lawyer here in the High Court, and Justice A.K. Sikri Saab. I must say, all three personalities who have been brought together today by the Guru Nanak University Law Department under the chairpersonship of Dr. Baljit Kaur, they are really doing a great job. I must salute you all. Wish yourself a very good luck, sir, and wish yourself a very good luck, Vimal ji, and regards to ma'am. Wish you very good luck. Please, sir.
Yes, Bimal ji, now do I have to say something or shall we wait till 5 o'clock?
Sir, you can share your experiences in the meanwhile for our students and faculty before going to the actual topic. You have been introduced, and now the entire stadium is with you, sir.
Thank you very much. First of all, I wish to convey my gratitude and heartfelt happiness for GNDU to have introduced this platform and to put together a number of students who would need inculcation of knowledge and inputs at a time when they are not able to attend regular classes or even have court visits or cannot do internships or are not in a position to physically visit their institutions. My association with Punjab University goes back to a time when I joined the law department when Mr. Gagan Bal's father, Sardar Gurmeet Singh, used to be the officer in charge. And I have very warm memories of the discipline, of the high regard of knowledge and the degree of sincerity with which he used to serve the institution. Punjab University has a very rich heritage which we brought from Lahore and then from Shimla, and now the Department of Laws, which is my old alumni, is a place where I learned the beginnings of family law with Dr. Paras Diwan, then with Dr. Kumar, and I found my steps to London to do a master's at the School of Oriental and African Studies, where I was a pupil under Dr. Werner Mensky, who had been handpicked by the famous Dr. John Duncan M. Direct, the famous professor of Hindu law, who as an Englishman had written 8 books on Indian family law, and he had super specialized in Hindu family law. But I looked at the larger perspectives of family law, and I did comparative family law at the London School of Economics for an elective. And after finishing my law, I came back. Then my younger brother went on a Felix scholarship and did the same course. Then over the years, after I got into practice, I started primarily as a service law lawyer under my senior, the very revered and esteemed Sardar Kuldeep Singh, the Green Judge, who used to be the lead practicing lawyer. He was a barrister from England. And I learned my appearances, I learned my law from him. I served with him as a counsel in his chambers for 2 years, till in 1988 he left for Delhi and became Additional Solicitor General of India. And after that I've been on my own, and he has taught me one thing. He has taught me to be independent. He has taught me to think on my own. He has inculcated so many good sincerity values in me, honesty, integrity, which I have followed till date. And I'm happy to say that he has always held that if you have worked with me, then you need not work with anybody. Friends, I have never appeared with anybody other than Sardar Kuldeep Singh in my entire career of 36 years of practice now. Maybe on a rare occasion with Mr. Rodgi recently in a matter where kidnapping was invoked for a child removal case. Otherwise, I have always been on my own. I and my brother Ranjit, who is also a Master's in Law from London, we have authored 8 books on subjects relating to problems of non-resident Indians. We have written on child laws, we have written on surrogacy, we have written on citizenship, nationality, immigration. We have covered the entire realm of family law and international law from the perspective of citizenship, nationality, passports, visas, and we have now compiled our 9th book, which is called The Global Indians in the Law. And this lockdown has helped me to really look into newer aspects of child abduction law, surrogacy law, which are almost in the final stages of being enacted, particularly in surrogacy, where there are 2 bills which are now nearing finality. And this is a good time for putting things together, and hopefully we may see people reading books again, because we may now see things changing so fast. We may perhaps not be able to achieve normal visits to courts, and a time will now come when we will have to perhaps evolve a new method of working, a new method of practicing, and seeing to our numbers. We will have to be very cautious in observing social distancing in courts, because till this COVID-19 ailment does not find a vaccine cure, social distancing may be the only way of keeping abreast and observing caution. We have done well till now. I talk to friends, clients, and honorable judges all over the world. We are still very well off in the terms of fatalities. We have managed to control the problem and managed to coordinate the issues by sensibly taking precautions, which most of the jurisdictions have not. But friends, the future is going to be very different. And the legal profession, which is all about court work, which is all about court appearances and court skills, is going to see a big change. But if any of you may have read Justice A.P. Shah's write-up in the Times of India today, he has opened up the vision of e-courts, and he has referred to a book release of Richard Susskind, who has described that the vision should be that courts should be a place of service. Court should be a place, and courts should be not a place of service. So the concept which he has brought forth has changed, and Justice A.P. Shah is talking of technophobia. We are, as a big country, particularly among the lawyers category, not very familiar with technology. But friends, let me tell you, as a practitioner, I am 60 years of age. I have learned technology. To be a good lawyer, you must know technology. If you do not know technology, you cannot be a good lawyer anymore. Things have changed. If you can handle work successfully through the medium of a computer, a laptop, or even an Apple phone, you can manage your office without a physical space. I can now control litigation all over the world by sitting in Chandigarh. I don't think it matters anymore. I don't think it matters anymore as to where you are. It matters how can you reach your client? How can you help your client? How can you provide a service to your client? So this, friends, is going to be the future. In our High Court, we have complete e-technology. Justice Hemant Gupta, when he was on the bench in Chandigarh, had fully prepared the court. Then Justice Suryakant assisted greatly. Then Justice Rajiv Bhalla did a lot. And thereafter, Justice Bindal did a lot. I must share with you, I was on the Hague Committee constituted by the Government of India. This was a committee constituted by the Government of India in which there were 6 judges, 6 government officers, and I was the only lawyer. And this was formulated by the government to look into a problem for seeing whether India should sign the Hague Convention on Child Abduction. So during the course of our interactions, we realized that unless we talk to people all over the world, it will not work. Unless we elicit views and we have the inputs from people from the different parts of the world, it would not work. So we held meetings by video conferencing, sitting in the Judicial Academy in Chandigarh, sitting in the High Court committee room, sitting in the committee room of the Delhi High Court, sitting in Haryana Bhavan in Delhi, sitting in the Judicial Academy in Bangalore, and we were able to talk to a lot of people. We were in the American government requested us that we should talk to some American judges, and we did talk to them also. How was all this possible? This was possible only because of technology. And we were able to put together a 2-volume report in which we have suggested the enactment of a bill, which the government is looking into. So the bottom line which I wish to convey to you is, if you are learners of law, please adapt to technology as fast as you can. Let technophobia, as Justice A.P. Shah puts it, be not a hurdle in your way, and let not the fear of technology deter you. I remember at a time when I joined the bar, the cause lists used to be manually printed and cyclostyled and distributed all over the city by peons on cycles, and the files would physically go by carriers on cycles to judges' houses. The dictation work used to be all manual. There used to be a stenographer in courts or in offices of lawyers who would take dictation in shorthand, and it would come next day. And that's how things worked. This is still the practice in some places, though the stenographers have replaced computer operators. But if you don't know how to use the computer and you're relying on somebody and you need to do work urgently, emergently, or outside your office or on your own, then you're helpless. So your knowledge of law or your degree of law or your empowerment of law will not help you if you're not technology trained. Now this takes us to the farthest end of how are we going to manage courts. This is going to be a big issue, and from very urgent cases to extremely urgent cases, we will now have to come down to normal working for normal cases through electronic means. Bombay is already doing it. Kerala is already doing it. Delhi has opened up slightly. Supreme Court is evolving methods. So slowly this friendly relationship with technology will probably bind new bonds, will perhaps create a new jurisprudence. And in the realm of family law, this is going to be very important because people will not be able to travel, particularly cross-border matters relating to family law issues. Travel will be very difficult. So in this scenario, in this backdrop, how far is the future going to be successful? How will we proceed? What will we do? Is going to be a very testing and a trying time. The High Court, with 55 honorable judges, 86 courtrooms, a seat of 3 jurisdictions, has a footfall of over 15,000 people every day. When I joined the bar, local buses used to go inside. Now you cannot even walk. The corridors are crowded. There is no place to park. There are 10,000 lawyers on the rolls of the Bar Association. But will so many people be able to go to court? And what will be the norm with which we will work? How will we practice? How will we file petitions? How will they be listed? How will matters be heard? This is going to be a serious issue, and the courts will have to now perhaps devise ways and means of putting things together, and we may have an e-jurisprudence, and perhaps even rights of parties may be reduced to e-rights or virtual rights. There may be no physical rights because you can't execute them. But then commercial matters will not wait. Life and liberty will not wait. Life and other issues related to criminal jurisprudence, trials, bail will not wait. So, furthermore, we already have a serious arrears issue. By being under a lockdown for over a month now, we must appreciate how much backlog have we collected. How will we resolve that? When will we hear those cases? As it is, the courts are overburdened. On an average, any honorable judge will have 25 to 50 fresh matters, another 50 plus motion matters, and a regular list which will have at least 500 to 1,000 cases on his board. Who will hear them? When will they be heard? How will we prioritize? These are serious issues which will have to be resolved, or an action plan will have to be created so that this issue can be sorted out. Now that the date of April is also gone, we are now going to wait for the date of 2nd May. So what is going to happen on 2nd May? We don't know. But I think this is a time in the integrum in which a thought process must evolve on the way forward. We have a Supreme Court and we have high courts all over the country, but every individual high court under the CPC has the power to make its own rules, and internally this process can be devised, and courts will have to probably put their heads together in seeing what best we can do. So friends, this is something which will concern us very seriously. There will be new definitions in law, frustrating contracts. There will be new concepts because of which obligations will be avoided. There will be brand new rights. There will be duties. There will be obligations. Law will have to provide support systems, mechanisms. And this is not going to be a problem of India alone. This is going to be a nationwide problem. Commercial laws will need revamping. Family laws will need relooking into. I have just finished revising the chapters on surrogacy in a new book. We have reached a pinnacle of the surrogacy bill, the Surrogacy Regulation Bill 2020 and a Artificial Reproductive Technology Regulation Bill 2020. And a lot of things which were decided in those bills and which would ultimately reach in Parliament after they were looked into by select committees and various professional bodies, will now probably have to go back again. Maybe surrogacy may have to open up. There may be people normal people who want to adopt to surrogacy for medical reasons, for hygiene reasons, for professional reasons, for personal reasons. And law will have to make space. law surrogacy may it may no longer be a valid proposition to say that surrogacy will be restricted to infertile Indian couples with 5 years of marriage. This may be a concept which may not perhaps be adaptable to the future after this going away of the virus issues. So friends, this is going to pose challenges not only in working of courts, but this is going to seriously call for relooking insofar legislations are also concerned. It's very difficult in India to make a new law. It's easy to amend a law, so there may be amendments. But where laws are in the making, they will need to be looked into. And that brings us to the issue of interparental child removal. We are still making a law. We will need to look at a law. We will need to rethink of a law. So this scenario is going to be a challenge.
Malhotra sir, you have been muted somehow.
Okay.
Sir, I just hold you for a minute, and now can we start with the topic of today?
Yes, by all means. By all means.
Can you hear me? Please introduce, sir, once again. Many participants have joined.
Can everybody hear me?
Sir, are you there?
Gagan
sir?
I'm there.
Okay. I introduce you.
Gaganji, you will have to say all those wonderful things once again.
No, sir. It's always a player. I would repeat, and rather I would be able to express more now, since there are many participants who have joined.
Yes.
With all sense of responsibility, I must say, when you enter the profession, and most of you would be joining the profession, you have to look upon certain personalities to follow and imbibe their values, their system, and their persona, their professionalism as well. You see how people, they express themselves, their oration, their knowledge of law. When I went to the court in 97, I saw Shri Anil Malhotra ji arguing a matter. Oh my God. He came up so well, so eloquently, so impressive. I felt, and I told one of my friends, if you have to be a lawyer, be 50% of Shri Anil Malhotra ji, you will be successful in life. We have seen Sibal Saab, Hiralal Sibal Saab, our senior, Shri M.L. Sareen ji, Shri Jagannath Kaushal ji, and the next generation, Shri Anil Malhotra ji, and all personalities who have come after him, they all have felt that he is one such person who, when he argues, is class apart. I will repeat once again. I was in London. Hello. I was in London. Someone told me there that Shri Anil Malhotra ji would be there in London. Hello, are you getting me?
Yes.
That Shri Anil Malhotra ji would be in London. I said, I must make an endeavor to go to listen to his views once again, and that too in a foreign soil. But unfortunately, I couldn't do, because I had to travel down to Edinburgh where my tickets had been booked. But thereafter, the gentleman told me that he was so impressive that he had cast a spell all over, and none was there the others who were speakers were not a patch on him. I said, yes, he is our elder brother. He is one of the most versatile lawyers. And when we went to the profession, we all realized that even if you have to be lawyers, be 50% like him, you will be successful. So I must say, you are so lucky, all of you, to be with us and with the entire fraternity here. And under the aegis of Ma'am, Dr. Kuljit Kaur ji and Vimal ji, they have brought us together. This is really an opportunity for each of you and me once again to listen to the explicit views of none else than the great Shri Anil Malhotra ji. Salutes to him, salutes to the HOD ma'am, Dr. Kuljit Kaur and Dr. Vimal ji and all participants. I wish you all a very good luck, and I must acknowledge that to myself also, that I am so lucky and honored to hear my elder brother's views once again on this Zoom today. Very good luck to you all, and good luck to you, sir. And we will continue to listen to you for all times as we can. All respects from the cockles of our heart, sir.
Thank you very much, Gagan. So nice of you for once again for adding to the wonderful introduction with so many adjectives and so many compliments. I hope I am able to meet your standards and achieve the benchmark which you have set, which may be difficult late in the evening on a COVID day.
Anyway. Sir, you are class. Sir, you are class, sir. Thank you, sir.
Anyway, friends, this is the beginning now. At the outset, I wish to thank GNDU and the teachers and the faculty members and Justice Rajiv Bhalla who have given me this opportunity to speak on this topic and look at a perspective from an angle which concerns children and which concerns society. I must share with you that I happened to assist Justice Rajiv Bhalla for 12 years as an amicus in a matter in which a child was removed from Punjab and taken to England. It was a reverse removal. Normally, removals take place when children are brought to India, but this was a removal of an Indian child by an aunt to England, violating an interim order granted by his court against a guardianship order given by a family court in Punjab. So it took us 12 years till he retired, and we were not able to get the child back despite him getting a first information report recorded, handing over the matter to Punjab Police for investigation, ultimately transferring the matter to the CBI, sending a team to London to find the child, and so on and so forth. We reached a stage where we found the child once. I happened to be in England, so he passed an order that I should bring the child back with me. But by the time the British police could locate the child had been removed again. We never found the child again. And the child turned 18, so the petition became infructuous. But before he demitted office, I submitted a report in his court about the existing state of law. And his report, my report and his order was taken on by the Law Commission of India, which formulated another report and referred to the government. The Ministry of Women and Child Development reacted to all that and constituted a committee, which popularly ultimately came to be known as the Hague Committee. And Justice Bindal headed the committee. We sat over it for over a year. We have submitted a report. But my association with Justice Bhalla for over 12 years, when on every Friday, literally he would hear the matter, the sincerity, the devotion, and the perseverance with which he pursued the matter was excellent. Despite being seized of a division bench roster, despite having individual matters of his single bench roster, he still kept on that matter because it was part heard before him. And there was never a let up of any effort on his part. And it was his sincere perseverance, his commitment to the cause of children, which was really remarkable. Justice Bhalla, I knew him as a practitioner. He was a civil lawyer and he specialized in revenue law. But he branched out into an area of law which was alien to him. But we did remarkably well, and it is in that perspective that I learned so much from him. And that is how we dwelt on the concept of the socio-legal aspects of children. Friends, children are the future. Now, children are our future. Then why are we not trying harder to find solutions to help them? I feel that it is easier to build strong children than to repair broken marriages. Children make your life important. Children give you a reason to live. Then why do we fight over children? then why do we talk of parental rights or rights of a father or a mother when we talk of custody of children? Why is it in the reverse? Custody battles are more for seeking vengeance on spouses vis-a-vis each other without being any child on the gender, to score on the other spouse, making the child a trophy to be won by the winning side to settle scores with the other. Is this how our jurisprudence and how litigation battles are conducted over children? This is the saddest part of child custody litigation, where custody battles are looked on from perspective of rights of parents, not rights of children. Now, this is going to be a complex situation when we are now going to look at virtual child rights jurisprudence, e-courts, virtual distances. Now, in this scenario, we will now be embarking, according to me, on a concept of joint custody with shared parenting and no gender preference. I'm marking these three words: joint custody, shared parenting, and no gender preference. So this is something which is going to seize us all in a very large perspective. And we will have to very seriously relook at our custody laws. We will seriously have to relook at our thinking, and we will have to relook at our concepts. Now, I find that everything stems from the directive principles of state policy, though they may be non-justiciable, but Article 39 says that the state shall in particular direct its policy towards securing that children are given opportunities and facilities to develop in a healthy manner and in conditions of freedom and dignity, and that childhood and youth are protected against exploitation and against moral and material abandonment. Very few of us know that there is a mandate in the directive principles of state policy on children. Children are an ignored community. They are not votes, they are not franchisee, therefore they have no voice. Because they have no voice, they have no rights. Because they have no rights, they do not get justice. So, I am going to look at today where we are on the voice of the child. Now, friends, a lot of you may not know that there is a United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. The United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child was adopted by the United Nations General Assembly on the 20th of November 1989. And the Government of India ratified this convention on the 11th of December 1992. There is another convention called the Hague Convention on Civil Aspects of International Child Abduction, which we have not signed, which I will deal with later and separately. But because we are a signatory to the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, I have now in my recent petitions in cases of child custody, mostly cross-border, started stepping on the rights of the children and requesting courts to switch to a child-centric jurisprudence rather than a spousal right fight, to focus on the issue at stake. Now, friends, the preamble of the UNCRC is very interesting, and I'm going to read just 4 lines of this. It says that the states parties to the present convention, convinced that the family as the fundamental group of society and the natural environment for the growth and well-being of all its members, and particularly children, should be afforded the necessary protection and assistance so that it can fully assume its responsibilities within the community. Further, recognizing that the child, for the full and harmonious development of his or her personality, should grow up in a family environment in an atmosphere of happiness, love, and understanding. Now, the UNCRC contains a number of provisions which protects the rights of children. And these rights are not in oblivion. I was able to persuade the Delhi High Court in 3 successive litigations that the rights of the children which are in the UNCRC are available and find mention in the Juvenile Justice Protection of Children Act 2015. Once the JJ Act was amended, the amended version of the Juvenile Justice Care and Protection of Children Act 2015 incorporated all the provisions of the UNCRC into the JJ Act. Why did they do this? Because once India signed an international convention, India is obligated to take those rights which are available in the convention and put them in an Indian law, which is how those laws will get teeth. Now, the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child has in it the rights of the child to life, which means family life, a right to an identity, a nationality, name, family relations, without unlawful interference, not to be separated from parents, expeditious family reunification, speedy decision on child's place of residence if parents are living separately, the right not to be deprived of family environment, and right of direct contact with both parents. Now, these are the, I'm not going to read the individual articles, but this is a crux of what the convention contains and which we have incorporated in the JJ Act. For the first time, the Supreme Court Justice Sen in ABC versus State, where he dwelt upon the rights of an unwed mother to a birth certificate minus the father's name, he took the convention and put it in the judgment, saying that these are enforceable rights and therefore the child has a right to a birth certificate without the father being named if the mother did not wish to do so. And there are other judgments of the Supreme Court also which say that in India, if the signatory to the convention, an international convention, the courts are obligated to adapt to those provisions in this perspective. Now, this brings me to the JJ Act. Very few of you may know that the JJ Act is one provision which defines what is the best interest of the child. And it reads in section 2, subsection 9, the best interest of the child means the basis of any decision taken regarding the child to ensure fulfillment of his basic rights and needs, identity, social well-being, and physical, emotional, and intellectual development. Now, this definition of the best interest of the child has been followed by the Delhi High Court in 3 judgments to say what is the best interest of the child. There was a lot of opposition that the Juvenile Justice Act is in the perspective of children who are often abandoned and surrendered, or children who are in need of care and protection. But the answer to that is straight away provided in section 2, subsection 14, where in the definition of children in need of care and protection, it is written that it pertains to children in respect of whom a law has been violated for the time being in force by a person who is their guardian or any other person. So if a parent is depriving another parent of the rights of the other parent, then the parental rights being infringed, a child in need of care and protection would mean a child who is covered under the Juvenile Justice Act. Now, section 3 of the JJ Act has adapted most of the provisions of the UNCRC And Section 3 says that the principle of best interest means to help develop the child to develop to full potential. The principle of family responsibility, care, nurture, and protection shall be primarily the responsibility of the biological family. And the principle of reparation and restoration of the right of the child to be reunited with the family. So if there is an argument that a child should not be returned to the custody of the other parent or to the shared custody of both parents, then the straight composite answer is now provided in the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, which is in the JJ Act and which can successfully be used to counter any argument that a parent be given individual or solitary custody. A lot of you may also not know that there is a National Charter for Children 2003, which is published in the Government of India Gazette, and which talks of rights of children, their rights to have a family, right to be reunited, and the common responsibility being of rearing being with both the persons. Now, friends, other than making the JJ Act, we also made the Commission for Protection of Child Rights Act 2005, under which we made a National Commission for Protection of Child Rights, and we made Commission for Protection of Child Rights in states also. The Punjab, Haryana, and UT government did not make any. There was very serious, rampant violation of child rights in Haryana. I was a court commissioner, and we discovered a lot of child abuse, pursuant to which the National Commission started writing to the governments. The governments did nothing. Then ultimately, I filed a petition on behalf of the National Commission for Protection of Child Rights in the Punjab and Haryana High Court. And Honorable Justice Sikri, on the last day of his demitting office in Chandigarh on 9th of April 2013, passed a very detailed judgment directing governments, Punjab, Haryana, and UT, to make commissions and seriously look at implementing child rights. There are a lot of provisions in the Protection of Child Rights Commission Act to safeguard the interests of children, but the commissions are not courts. They cannot pass orders. They can only make recommendations. But according to me, if these commissions were to seriously do their job, half the matters in the High Court pertaining to children would not come to court. There is a complete machinery under the Juvenile Justice Care of Protection of Children Act 2005. It starts with the Child Welfare Committee, then there is an inspection committee, then there are state level committees, and then there are national committees. So there is a ladder of committees, and most of these committees have to be constituted by people with specified qualifications, and these committees have to be formulated by committees which are headed by honorable judges to select such people. Now, how far they are actually implemented is a different story. But there exists in our system a complete infrastructure of protection of children insofar all these issues are concerned. So, other than the law in this Commissions Act, we have the POCSO, that is the Protection of Children Against Sexual Offences Act. We have the Right to Compulsory Education Act, which are adequately giving protection to children from various other perspectives in which various rights are given to children. So friends, this is one part of the scenario vis-a-vis building up of a child rights jurisprudence. But coming back to the issue which comes to us today is, how do we deal with children in custody battles? What is the law? How far is statute law good? What is the change required? So the principal legislation on this perspective is the Guardian and Wards Act 1890. It's not 1980, it's 1890. It is a colonial outmoded British legislation which was made in the times when the British needed it. Now, the Guardian and Wards Act and the Hindu Minority and Guardianship Act are the two principal legislations which hold the fort in the field. The Hindu Minority and Guardianship Act, other than identifying the father and the mother as the natural guardian, does no more. It does not take you to court. It does not give you a statutory remedy by virtue of invoking a particular provision or a section to file a petition. So if you have to seek custody, depriving another parent of the custody of the child, then you have to invoke the Guardian and Wards Act, read with the Hindu Minority and Guardianship Act, to file a petition seeking sole or exclusive custody. Now, this is a very strange or an archaic method that a natural parent has, who is the natural guardian of his or of his son or daughter, has to invoke the provisions of the Guardian and Wards Act to become a guardian to his own child, despite the fact that he is the natural guardian of the child. Now, this I find is an anomaly in terms. So very quickly, what does the Guardian and Wards Act do? The Guardian and Wards Act talks of a guardian. In section 4, section 4 says that a guardian is a person having the care of a person, of a minor or his property, or both of his person and his property. Now, there is a definition of a guardian. There is no definition of custody. There is no definition of joint custody. These are concepts which don't find mention. Then section 7 talks of the powers of the court to appoint a guardian. Section 12 talks of interim custody issues. Section 17 talks of matters to be considered in appointing a guardian, and welfare of the child is the paramount consideration. Section 19 talks of when a guardian should not be appointed, and it says very specifically in section 19b that if the father or the mother is available and is not unfit, then nobody else can be appointed a guardian. Section 25 talks of reverting the child back to the custody of a guardian if removed from a lawful custody. So friends, this is the Guardian and Wards Act 1890. And I will very quickly, after looking at the Hindu Minority and Guardianship Act, come to a recent report of the Law Commission which suggests changes. Then we have the Hindu Minority and Guardianship Act made in 1956. Now the Hindu Minority and Guardianship Act 1956 in section 2 says that it is supplemental to the Guardian and Wards Act, and it is in addition to and not in derogation of the provision of the Guardian and Wards Act.
Mr. Malhotra,
yes.
Can I just interrupt you for a moment? I'd like to welcome Justice.
Yes. I'm so sorry. I thought of welcoming you, but then I thought protocol-wise I have to wait for Justice Sikri.
No.
But please continue with your. I'm here.
Sir,
I just want to thank you, sir, for that. I know you were just speaking and you just finished speaking before on another platform. So I just want to thank you, and I'll request Malhotra to continue, and after that we'll hear you, sir. Thank you very much. Thank you.
On that note, now that I have the opportunity to do so, I owe this learning of this branch of law first to Justice Bhalla and then to Justice Sikri. While they were not here, as I told you, 12 years in Justice Bhalla's court as an amicus and 3 years in Justice Sikri's court, getting an order from him to frame commissions and assisting him as an amicus. I visibly remember Justice Sikri told me once, forget that you are a counsel for the commission. Please give your suggestions in writing as a lawyer, as not as a counsel for parties, but just as a lawyer. And all counsels were told that this is not a adversarial litigation. This is
as a friend of the court.
As a friend of the court, very visible, sir. And he made us file very concise and crisp suggestions. And I remember 9th of April 2013, he was demitting office. He was to leave at 4 o'clock, and 2 o'clock he pronounced the judgment. And that judgment was a landmark judgment which got commissions for protection of child rights in Punjab, Haryana, and in Chandigarh. I was able to convince him that we should have honorable judges heading these commissions. He did agree. But the government got it watered down, and ultimately the Supreme Court changed the view because he had followed some other judgment. But the fact of the matter is that the pioneer in this field was Justice Sikri. And Justice Sikri's views subsequently on the bench in the Supreme Court on child-centric jurisprudence is something I'll come to later on. But just going back to Justice Bhalla, as I was telling you all, a revenue lawyer who learned civil law and then became a judge and handled practically everything on the roster would call me on every Friday for 12 years and say, what has happened in Ashley Kapoor? Where is that child gone? It was a child removed from the borders of Punjab to UK on a false passport by an aunt. We tried everything under the book. We did everything. But we were not able to get the child. But the result of his consistent, persistent efforts and sincerity was that I submitted a report. He passed a detailed order. The government took it on board. Law Commission gave a report. Government of India made a committee, and we have another report, and there is a law in the making. So these are the men who have had commitment to this cause of children. And when Justice Bhalla asked me, can we talk of children? I said, why not? Then overnight, I requested Justice Sikri, who said he's in another session, but children brought him back. So I'm very grateful to both Justice Bhalla and Justice Sikri for not only being devoted to the cause, but for still, despite their schedules and their involvements after retirement, to be still committed to the cause, which they very, very seriously and very, very genuinely pursued, both off the bench and on the bench. So friends, coming back now to the subject. So as I told you, the Guardian and Wards Act 1890, an outmoded legislation, falls with the Hindu Minority and Guardianship Act falling under it, was looked at by the Law Commission in report number 257 in May 2015. And the report titled Reforms in Guardian and Custody Laws in India was very striking. But like all Law Commission reports, it is on the shelves. It never reached Parliament because that is a very long route. But I must share with you that the Law Commission report looks at joint custody, and it very seriously talks of looking at a definition of joint custody. The report refers to a definition given by a Mumbai-based NGO to say what is joint custody. Joint custody is said to be a child custody by which a child may reside alternatively, 1 week with the custodial parent and 1 week with the non-custodial parent, and both the custodial and non-custodial parent shall share joint responsibility for decisions involving child's long-term care, welfare, and development. So this was a definition which the Law Commission thought was a very good proposition. Then the Law Commission also felt that after seeking about 200 responses, that the children need both the mother and the father. They talk to both parents. Shared physical custody without shared legal custody will lead to believe parents do not have equal authority. Shared parenting will reduce acrimony. And it was suggested that joint custody in India should be the forum for 3 reasons. Firstly, with rapidly changing social and economic changes, conjugal and family relationships are becoming complex. Now, with distancing, with people living in different continents, people living over the globe, and not being able to meet, this is going to be a very important factor. Then the second issue was, which as they quote Flavia Agnes saying, in modern day custody battles, neither the father as a traditional natural guardian nor the mother as the biologically equipped parent to care for the child of tender age are routinely awarded custody. The principal best interest of the child takes into consideration the existing living arrangements and home environment of the child. Each case has to be decided taking into overall assessment. Third area of shared custody they talk of is that there has to be a law on this concept. The Law Commission felt that shared and equal guardianship of both parents was a serious recommendation which needed to be considered by the Government of India. Now, this matter did not go that far and we do not know what happened with it. Now, I must also share with you that there was a recent study conducted by the University of Westminster. I must share with you that 2 years ago, Justice Sikri very kindly agreed to address a very close group of judges and lawyers, specialists in family law at the University of Westminster. We happened to accompany him to that meeting, and he delivered the keynote address. And that think tank was looking at child custody laws over the globe and how thinking had developed and how things needed to change. Then the University of Westminster came up with a report on the voice of the child in international child abduction. Now, very interestingly, this report of the University of Westminster looks at Article 12 of the UNCRC, where there is a voice of the child. And they talk of a child-centric approach, which is a phrase which Justice Sikri has used in 2 of his judgments in the Supreme Court. And this report says that children should be heard in the decision-making process. Now, there is a very interesting sentence at the end of the report which says, courts need to understand that they are not deciding a parking ticket when they hear a custody matter. They need to look at the individual circumstances because this is a defining moment in a child's life. So this is the kind of perspective which goes on internationally. And it is in this perspective things go on. Now, friends, let me take you to a recent example of an extreme end. The way I, as a student of law, look at things, to look at the logic of law, to look at a neutral approach, you need to see what is the extreme end. A child was removed by a parent of Indian origin from the custody of a mother in Delhi. The lady happened to be a US national. They were going through a custody battle. The father was, so to say, unhappy with the results of his litigation for whatever reason. So he removed the child to Dubai and he converted to Muslim religion. The Delhi High Court developed the matter into summoning him, asking him, acting on a writ of habeas corpus, and ultimately suo moto, a case of kidnapping under section 361 and 363 IPC was registered. He was convicted, he did not appear, he was convicted of criminal contempt, and a team was constituted by the CBI to bring him back from Dubai. Till the matter went to Supreme Court. I was asked to assist a senior counsel in the Supreme Court, and we challenged that order. The matter is still sought to be settled. But the issue is, can we take a child custody matter to an extreme end to invoke criminal law and bring in kidnapping? Can we pollute child custody laws with criminal law? Is the custody issue a civil proposition vis-a-vis interparents? I can understand a situation where a child is removed from the lawful custody of a parent by a third person or kidnapped. That is different. But when it is interparental child removal, is it a civil wrong or is it a criminal offense? Where do we need to draw a line? As I say again, to come to a logical end, we have to look at extreme ends of the argument. What is one end? As we are following, whenever there is a child removal in India, to India, we send the spouse back with all the protections. If the court agrees, the court says the spouse will go back, but you will not do criminal prosecution. You will give benefits to the lady or the other spouse, whoever it may be. You will get the matter settled amicably, etc., etc. But when it comes to a reverse case, should we invoke the IPC to bring the offending parent back? Can we have, in terms, different principles for resolving this issue just because we have no law? Now, this brings me to the Hague Convention on Civil Aspects of International Child Abduction, 1980. It is a convention signed by 100 countries. India has not signed it for reasons best known. The Hague Convention on Civil Aspects of International Child Abduction, 1980, though uses the word abduction in the title, but when you read the convention, the word abduction is nowhere. The offense in the convention is in civil terms. and it is called wrongful removal or retention. And it is said that a child is wrongfully retained or removed if there is a violation of the custody rights of the other parent, which are in exercise by the other parent and which the other parent is deprived of in exercising if the child is removed from his or her custody. The Law Commission has also looked into this, and it has seriously opined that child abduction cannot be converted into criminal offense, simply for the reason no court will want, or no child will want, a parent to go to prison for removing him or her from the custody of the other parent. We have to build a home. We don't have to break a home. If you imprison a parent, look at the devastating effect it will have on the psychology of the child. Look at the damage it will do to the family. That family will never reunite again. So I would seriously think that this is a perspective which needs to be looked into. I was able to prevail over the senior counsel whom I assisted in this matter as a rare occasion to say that we should tell the court that the parent who has removed the child is, we hold no brief for what he has done, but he's not a terrorist. And this is what the Supreme Court in its wisdom has very wisely done. It said, please come back. He has come back. The Supreme Court said, we will try to resolve the matter. Unfortunately, the situation worsened and this proposition is different now. But the matter is that the wisdom shown by the Supreme Court in trying to put an effort to resolve the matter amicably is what is needed in child custody matters. So friends, with this proposition, I now take a rundown on how the law is and was in this perspective.
Mr. Malhotra, can I just interrupt?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
If you could, I'm sorry, it may sound a little rude, but
yes, no.
We'd like to have Justice Sikri as soon as possible, with His Lordship's permission and your thing, if you can.
No. Let Mr. Malhotra continue. I'll only give my concluding remarks. That's all.
I will take precisely 10 minutes to wrap it up.
I was looking at you on the side, therefore I thought.
Okay. So
10 minutes means 10 minutes multiplied by 60 seconds.
Otherwise, you will dismiss my case.
No, I'll mute you.
This is the new technology way of saying I'll mute you if you argue excess.
So now judges will have to tell the lawyer we are going to mute you, not we'll dismiss your case.
No, they'll say I am going offline. That is better. So friends, very quickly, the way law has developed, very quickly, 1984, Surinder Kaur, Justice Chandrachud's famous celebrated judgment, jurisdiction which has closest contact should take on. This is a principle which is finding adherence even now. The second principle which adheres very strictly now is parens patriae. Parens patriae is a jurisdiction which is vested with a court, a superior court, a high court, or a Supreme Court, wherein the court as the overall custodian of the child in its custody can pass any other orders, whatever it deems fit, in the facts and circumstances of the case. Then the courts have also said that temporary residence of a child in a jurisdiction does not confer jurisdiction on the court. Then there are 4 or 5 important judgments I will harp on very quickly. Now, the most recent judgment on saying that the welfare of the children is not to be superseded by parental rights is Perry Kasangra's judgment given by the Supreme Court in 2019. It is following a 2010 judgment, and I'm only going to read 3 lines from the judgment which say, statutory provisions dealing with the custody of the child under any personal law cannot and must not supersede the paramount consideration as to what is conducive to the welfare of the minor. In fact, no statute on the subject can ignore, eschew, or obliterate the vital factor of the welfare of the minor. So this is something very important. So for a parent to say that I, as a primary caregiver, or I as a parent with the custody of a minor child of tender years, have a preferential parental right, has been demolished, so to say, in this proposition. Then the second judgment which has broken the barrier of gender preference is Lahari Sakha Muri, a 2019 judgment upholding a judgment of the Andhra Pradesh High Court, wherein the Supreme Court says the expression best interest of the child, which is always kept to be of paramount consideration, is indeed wide in its connotation, and I stress it cannot remain the love and care of the primary caregiver, i.e. the mother in the case of the infant, or the child who is only a few years old. Now this is important. The definition of best interest of the child as envisaged in Section 2 of the JJ Act as to mean the basis for any decision taken regarding the child to ensure fulfillment of his basic rights and needs, identify social well-being and physical, emotional and intellectual development. So this is a judgment in 2019 which has broken the ceiling of gender preference. Then the celebrated judgment given by Justice Sikri on parental alienation syndrome is Vivek Singh versus Rumani Singh, 2017. Now I'm going to read one paragraph of it because when parents divide children, what happens to the child is very well discussed in this, and probably for the first time looked at by the Supreme Court with such emphasis that it has very, very grave implications. It is said, the best interest of the child has been placed at the vanguard of family/custody disputes according to the optimal growth and breakdown of the child primacy over other considerations. The child is often left to grapple with the breakdown of an adult institution, while the parents aim to ensure that the child is at least affected by the outcome. The inevitability of the uncertainty that follows regarding the child's growth lingers on till the new routine sinks in. The effect of separation of spouses on children psychologically, emotionally, and even to some extent physically spans from negligible to serious, which could be insignificantly noticeably critical. It could have the effect that are more immediate and transitory to long-lasting, thereby having significant negative repercussion in the advancement of the child. While these effects don't apply to every child of a separated or divorced couple, nor has any child experienced all these effects, the deleterious effects of maladjustment remains the objective of the parents to evade and the courts intend to circumvent. Very well put. The right of the child is also based on individual dignity. My Lord further adds, child-centric human rights jurisprudence that has been evolved over a period of time is founded on the principle that public good demands proper growth of the child who are the future of the nation. Further, no doubt the presumption is in favor of the maternal custody as sound welfare policy is rebuttable in a given case. It can be shown, now this is very important, that the father is better suited to have the custody of the child. Such an assessment, however, can only be after level playing field is granted to both the parents. And in this case, the court did grant an opportunity to the father to come to the level playing field before it could come to a conclusion. Now, all this has been followed by the Supreme Court, but I'm not going to labor on it in detail. And I am only going to refer to one more judgment of the Supreme Court, which is the last in point of time. This is Tejaswini Gaur, rendered on 6th of May 2019. Now, in this, the Supreme Court has again harped on welfare. It says, the court, while deciding the child custody cases, is not bound by the legal right of the parent or the guardian, though the provisions of the special statutes govern the rights of the parents, but the welfare of the child is of paramount consideration. Paramount consideration ought to be the child interest in the welfare of the child. So friends, this is the very quick rundown I have been able to gather in the short time I have got. But I wish to end with what Wordsworth said, William Wordsworth said in 1802. Now this is a poem called My Heart Leaps Up. The poem is also known as The Rainbow. And the words which have always struck me in this word is, child is the father of the man. I'm going to read the poem. It says, the poem is, my heart leaps up. My heart leaps up when I behold a rainbow in the sky. So was it when my life began. So it now I am a man. So be it when I shall grow old, or let me die. The child is the father of the man, and I wish my days to be bound each to each by natural piety. Thank you very much. Justice Bhalla, I have done the needful in 8 minutes. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Sir, I welcome you once again. Justice Sikri, as you all know, has been Chief Justice of the Punjab and Haryana High Court. So Amritsar was part of his jurisdiction, then a judge of the Supreme Court. And I'll remind him something he's forgotten. About 3.5 years ago, we did a seminar in London regarding removal of children from borders. And Justice Sikri was to come, but he couldn't come. And I read out his message in Leeds, and exactly about 50 kilometers from where Wadsworth is buried. That's in Windermere is Wadsworth's village. So taking a little cue from that, sir, I hand it over to you. And the child being the father of man, that's the topic today. So with your remarks, we'd like to hear you on that, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Justice Bhalla. And I must congratulate Mr. Malhotra also for his outstanding lecture today on this very difficult subject. Difficult may not be, but it is really difficult when we have to decide such cases. And it is not only emotional, such a subject when it comes to the court, but it's a very delicate, and the kind of balance which is required to be maintained by the court in deciding the custody of child is really, really, I think in one of the judgments also I said that my 20 years experience as judge, I can say that deciding the custody of child is the most difficult task which a judge has to achieve when such disputes come. Of course, it is very easy. I mean, we know the principles, and which have been explained by Mr. Malhotra in a very erudite manner, that it's the voice of child which ultimately has to prevail. It's the welfare of the child that is the test, that ultimately what is in the best interest of the child. All these principles are there. But then one of these principles in a given case becomes a challenge, not only for the lawyers,